In the desolate, windswept plains of Nebraska Territory during the winter of 1883, a peculiar sight drew mockery from nearly every settler within 50 miles. An elderly homesteader, weathered and gray-haired, was deliberately burying his dwelling 6 feet into the earth, like a man digging his own grave. Younger families building proper timber cabins above ground laughed openly at his labor, whispering he'd lost his mind to loneliness and age. They called him foolish, primitive, even compared him to a burrowing animal retreating underground. Yet when the most catastrophic blizzard in territorial history descended upon their settlement that winter, this same underground shelter maintained a steady 65 degrees Fahrenheit inside while burning merely 3 logs per day. Meanwhile, his neighbors' conventional cabins struggled to reach 42 degrees, despite consuming 15 logs daily and burning precious furniture just to survive the night. The temperature difference was undeniable, 23 degrees warmer using 75% less firewood. What everyone had dismissed as the confused project of an aging man turned out to be brilliantly engineered survival technology refined over thousands of years, combining Native American Earth Lodge wisdom with European turf house principles and practical mining knowledge. Before we reveal how this extraordinary underground dwelling saved lives that brutal winter, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. These vanishing frontier survival techniques represent irreplaceable knowledge our ancestors depended on for life itself. Your subscription helps preserve these critical historical lessons while ensuring you never miss the remarkable true stories we continue uncovering. The Nebraska plains in the early 1880s presented homesteaders with a merciless landscape. Endless flat grassland stretched to every horizon, offering virtually no natural timber for construction, no sheltering hills to block relentless winds, and winter temperatures that regularly plunged below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Most settlers arriving with dreams of farming prosperity quickly discovered the harsh reality. Hauling lumber from distant railroad towns cost small fortunes. Traditional wooden cabins required enormous quantities of fuel to heat, and the screaming prairie winds found every gap and crack in hastily assembled walls. The typical pioneer family on these plains burned through cords upon cords of expensive imported firewood each winter, yet still huddled miserably in drafty structures where indoor temperatures barely stayed above freezing. During the worst cold snaps, children suffered frostbite while sleeping, elderly family members developed pneumonia, and the constant battle against cold consumed every waking hour. But the elderly homesteader at the center of this account possessed knowledge his younger neighbors lacked entirely. His name was Marcus Brennan, though settlement records preserved only scattered details of his earlier life, documenting that he'd spent more than 20 years working deep underground in Colorado silver mines before claiming his Nebraska homestead. Those decades laboring in mine shafts had taught Marcus something profound about the earth itself. Regardless of surface weather conditions, whether summer heat or winter blizzards raged above, mine tunnels maintained remarkably constant temperatures year-round. 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit persisted hundreds of feet below ground, a stable thermal environment that never fluctuated wildly like the air temperature. During his mining years in Colorado, Marcus had also encountered something else that fascinated him: abandoned Native American earth lodges built by Pawnee and Mandan peoples who'd inhabited the plains for countless generations before European settlement. These weren't crude dugouts or temporary shelters. They were sophisticated permanent dwellings, circular structures built partially underground with thick earthen walls and roofs covered in layers of sod and soil. Marcus had explored several of these ancient earth lodges during his travels, marveling at their ingenious construction. Even in abandoned condition, after decades of weather exposure, the interiors remained noticeably warmer than outside air during winter and cooler during summer heat. The thick earth covering acted as natural insulation, moderating temperature extremes through sheer thermal mass. He'd also read about similar building techniques from distant lands, Icelandic turf houses where families survived Arctic winters, in structures built from stacked sod with roofs covered in growing grass, and Norwegian earthen dwellings partially buried into hillsides for protection against brutal northern climates. All these diverse cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, had independently discovered the same fundamental truth: the earth itself provides superior insulation compared to any construction material humans could manufacture in primitive conditions. When Marcus finally claimed his quarter section of Nebraska prairie in 1882, he immediately recognized the challenge facing him. Virtually no timber existed for miles around. Hauling wood from railroad towns would bankrupt him within a single winter, and the exposed flatland offered zero natural wind protection. Younger settlers were stubbornly attempting to replicate the wooden cabins they'd known back east, spending their entire savings on imported lumber and still freezing through winters. Marcus chose a radically different approach. He would build exactly what the land itself provided: an earth-sheltered dwelling using the ground's natural insulation properties combined with the free building material literally beneath his feet: prairie sod. He selected his building site with careful consideration: a gentle, south-facing slope near a small creek that provided water access. The slope was crucial. It would allow him to excavate directly into the hillside rather than digging a hole in flat ground, providing natural drainage and structural support from the surrounding earth. Marcus began digging in late spring, when the ground had thawed, excavating a rectangular cavity approximately 16 feet wide, 20 feet deep, and extending 6 feet into the hillside. This backbreaking labor took him nearly 3 months of steady work, removing ton after ton of soil and piling it strategically nearby for later use. The excavated space would become his living quarters, positioned entirely below the normal ground level except for one small south-facing wall that would remain exposed. While Marcus worked steadily on his peculiar project, neighboring homesteaders began taking notice. They watched this gray-bearded old man digging what looked like an oversized grave and couldn't comprehend his purpose. Some thought he was preparing a root cellar. Others assumed he'd gone mad from isolation and was literally digging his own burial site. A younger settler named William Thompson recently arrived from Pennsylvania with his wife and 3 children, rode over one afternoon to investigate. He found Marcus chest deep in the excavation, methodically removing soil with a spade. "What in God's name are you doing, old-timer?" Thompson asked with barely concealed amusement. Marcus paused his digging, wiped sweat from his weathered face, and replied simply, "Building my home for winter." Thompson laughed outright. "You're building a house in a hole? You planning to live like a prairie dog?" Other neighbors who'd gathered to watch joined the laughter. One shouted, "The old fool thinks he's an Indian. Next, he'll be wearing feathers and dancing." Marcus didn't argue or defend his methods. He'd learned long ago that demonstration convinced skeptics far more effectively than explanations. He simply returned to his digging, while the younger men rode away shaking their heads, convinced the elderly homesteader had lost his mental faculties. Once the excavation reached its full depth, Marcus began the crucial next phase, constructing walls from prairie sod. Prairie sod was remarkable building material. Dense root systems from countless years of grass growth had woven the topsoil into thick matted blocks that could be cut and stacked like enormous bricks. Homesteaders called these cut sections Nebraska marble, half-jokingly, but the nickname held truth. Properly cut sod blocks measured roughly 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 4 inches thick, weighing approximately 50 pounds each. Marcus spent weeks cutting hundreds of these sod blocks from the prairie surrounding his excavation, using a special breaking plow designed specifically for this purpose. He stacked them carefully to form interior walls, creating a protective barrier 3 feet thick all around his underground room. This massive thickness was intentional, not structural necessity, but thermal mass. 3 feet of dense earth and root systems would provide extraordinary insulation, far superior to the thin wooden plank walls his neighbors relied upon. The rear wall of his dwelling required no sod construction at all. The excavated hillside itself formed a solid earthen barrier, packed soil that had been compressed by its own weight for thousands of years. Marcus simply smoothed this surface and left it exposed, allowing the ground's natural thermal properties to work in his favor. For the front wall facing south, Marcus built differently. Here he constructed a conventional wooden frame, the only portion of his dwelling that would rise above ground level. This south-facing exposure was deliberate. It would allow precious winter sunlight to enter through a small window, providing both light and passive solar heating during the day. He salvaged weathered planks from an abandoned wagon and built a sturdy door frame, then chinked every gap carefully with clay mixed with prairie grass. The roof presented the greatest engineering challenge. Marcus constructed a framework from cottonwood poles he'd laboriously hauled from the creek bottom, the only substantial wood available for miles. These poles spanned the width of his excavation, resting on the thick sod walls to distribute weight evenly. Over this wooden framework, he layered tar paper he'd purchased from the distant railroad town, his single major expense for the entire construction. Time, .4s. Then came the crucial final layer, earth itself. Marcus carefully spread 2 full feet of soil across his entire roof, using the excavated dirt he'd piled nearby months earlier. He packed this earth firmly, sloping it gently to shed rain and snow melt away from his dwelling. Finally, he planted prairie grass seed across the entire roof surface, creating a living layer that would establish root systems to hold everything in place and prevent erosion. By late autumn, Marcus had completed his earth-sheltered home. From a distance, it appeared as merely a small wooden door and single window emerging from a grass-covered hillside. Someone unfamiliar with the location could ride within 20 feet and never realize a dwelling existed there at all. The entire structure had been swallowed by the earth, invisible and protected. Inside, the space measured roughly 16 by 20 feet, providing 320 square feet of living area. This wasn't spacious by conventional standards, but Marcus lived alone and needed only enough room for a sleeping platform, small table, shelving for supplies, and most importantly, a compact cast-iron heating stove. That stove represented the heart of his heating strategy. Unlike his neighbors who required large stoves burning constantly to combat heat loss through thin wooden walls, Marcus needed only the smallest model available. The surrounding earth would maintain approximately 55 degrees naturally, meaning his stove only needed to raise interior temperature 10 additional degrees to reach comfortable living conditions. As Marcus moved into his completed earth lodge and winter approached, his neighbor's mockery intensified. William Thompson organized what he called a proper barn raising for another newcomer family, gathering a dozen homesteaders to construct a traditional timber cabin in a single weekend. During breaks from their work, the men speculated loudly about crazy old Marcus living in his burrow like a badger. Thompson's wife, Martha, expressed her opinion more directly to other settlement women. "It's shameful, an old man reduced to dwelling underground like a primitive savage. Someone should convince him to move into town before winter kills him in that dark hole." But Marcus paid no attention to their judgments. He'd spent those autumn weeks carefully preparing for winter, stockpiling a modest supply of firewood from creek-bottom willows and cottonwoods, preserving vegetables in his naturally cool underground pantry, and weatherproofing every potential draft around his door and window. The scientific principles underlying Marcus's earth-sheltered design were sophisticated, though he would have explained them in simpler practical terms based on his mining experience and observation of native dwellings. The fundamental concept involved thermal mass and the Earth's constant temperature zone. Below approximately 6 feet of depth in most climates, soil temperature remains remarkably stable year-round, typically between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface weather conditions. This occurs because the massive volume of Earth acts as thermal ballast, absorbing summer heat so slowly and releasing winter cold so gradually that deep soil never experiences the dramatic temperature swings that plague surface air. By building his dwelling 6 feet below grade with 3-foot thick earthen walls, Marcus had surrounded his living space with an enormous battery of thermal mass. During winter, while surface air temperatures plunged to negative 40 degrees, the earth encasing his home remained at its stable 55-degree baseline. This meant his interior space started with a massive 55-degree advantage before he even lit his stove. In contrast, his neighbors' wooden cabins offered minimal thermal mass. Thin plank walls had negligible heat storage capacity, meaning interior temperatures immediately reflected exterior conditions. When outside air reached negative 40 degrees, the interior of a wooden cabin might drop toward freezing within hours of a fire dying. The second crucial advantage of Marcus's design involved reduced surface area exposure. His dwelling presented only one small wall to exterior weather conditions, the south-facing entrance measuring perhaps 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall. Every other surface, his floor, 3 walls, and entire roof, sat surrounded by protective earth that never experienced temperature extremes. Compare this to a conventional cabin of similar interior size. All 4 walls plus the roof stood exposed to wind and cold, creating 5 full surfaces through which heat escaped continuously. The mathematical advantage was overwhelming. Marcus's structure lost heat through perhaps 60 square feet of exposed surface, while comparable wooden cabins lost heat through approximately 800 square feet. The thick earthen roof provided additional benefits beyond insulation. 2 feet of compacted soil created what modern engineers call R-value of approximately 40, meaning it resisted heat transfer 40 times better than an equivalent thickness of air. Even the finest wooden roof with the best available insulation materials of that era could barely achieve R value of 10. Moreover, the earthen roof's mass prevented the rapid temperature cycling that plagued conventional structures. During sunny winter days, Marcus's grass-covered roof actually absorbed solar radiation, warming gradually and releasing that captured heat slowly inward throughout the following night. As November arrived and temperatures began their seasonal descent, the settlement experienced its first serious cold snap. Overnight lows dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze water buckets solid and send families scrambling to feed their stoves throughout the night. William Thompson and his family burned through nearly 20 split logs that first brutal night, desperately feeding their cast-iron stove every 2 hours. Despite their efforts, they woke to find frost patterns decorating the interior walls near the ceiling, where warm stove-heated air met frigid surfaces. The children shivered under piles of quilts, and Martha complained bitterly about the impossible task of keeping a proper home in such God-forsaken country. Meanwhile, Marcus experienced that same night very differently. As evening approached, he lit a small fire in his compact stove using merely 3 split logs, allowing it to burn steadily for 2 hours before banking the coals with ash. The modest heat output quickly raised his interior temperature to a comfortable 65 degrees, and more importantly, that warmth remained stable throughout the entire night. The massive earthen walls absorbed excess heat from his stove, storing it within their dense mass. As the fire died down to embers and eventually went cold around midnight, those same walls gradually released their stored warmth back into the living space. Marcus slept soundly under a single wool blanket, never once waking to tend his fire, and rose the following morning to find interior temperature had dropped only to 60 degrees, still perfectly comfortable. He emerged from his underground entrance that morning to find the settlement blanketed in thick frost and neighbors already outside chopping more firewood for the day ahead. Thompson saw him and called out sarcastically, "Surprised you survived the night in your frozen cave, old man. We nearly burned the furniture just to keep from freezing." Marcus smiled, but said nothing. Let them learn the hard way when real winter arrived. December brought steadily worsening conditions. Weekly cold snaps saw temperatures regularly falling below zero, and the relentless prairie wind seemed to penetrate every gap and crack in conventional wooden construction. Families burned through their firewood stockpiles at alarming rates, and several homesteaders made desperate, expensive trips to the railroad town for additional supplies. The physical toll on conventional cabin dwellers became increasingly apparent. Children developed persistent coughs from breathing the extremely dry air superheated by constantly roaring stoves. Adults suffered chapped skin and nosebleeds from the desiccating indoor conditions. Nobody slept well, because someone had to wake every few hours to feed the ravenous fires. Marcus continued his quiet, comfortable existence underground. His daily routine involved lighting one small fire in the morning that burned for perhaps 3 hours, providing heat for cooking breakfast and warming his dwelling to comfortable temperature. That was it. The earthen walls maintained stable temperature all day, all evening, and throughout the night without any additional fuel. He used approximately 3 to 4 logs per day compared to his neighbors' 15 to 20 logs for the same period. The settlement's women began noticing something else remarkable about Marcus's situation. When they visited his underground home on errands, delivering occasional meals from charitable concern for the poor, isolated old man, they discovered conditions vastly superior to their own frigid cabins. The interior felt genuinely comfortable, not the harsh blast furnace heat near a roaring stove that gave way to icy cold in distant corners. The air quality seemed fresher somehow, less acrid with wood smoke, and humidity levels remained more natural rather than the parched dryness that characterized overheated wooden structures. Most surprising, Marcus's underground dwelling stayed remarkably clean. Conventional cabins accumulated constant dust and debris from wind infiltration through countless gaps in construction. Marcus's earth-sheltered walls, sealed tight against the surrounding soil, prevented such infiltration entirely. One particularly observant woman, elderly Anna Kowalski, who'd immigrated from Poland, recognized what she was seeing. She'd grown up in a partially underground cottage in her homeland, a traditional building style common in Eastern European villages. After visiting Marcus's Earth Lodge, she told other settlement women, "This man is not crazy. He builds the old way, the proven way. My grandmother's house looked exactly like this, and we never froze even when wolves hunted in the village square." But Anna's validation did little to change most neighbors' opinions. The men especially maintained their skepticism, insisting that proper American settlers built proper wooden houses regardless of climate challenges. Living underground was primitive, backward, something Indians and poor European peasants did because they lacked the resources and knowledge for better construction. Then came the blizzard that would change everything. On January 14th, 1884, the barometric pressure began dropping rapidly, and experienced plainsmen recognized the warning signs. A massive winter storm was building, something potentially more severe than anything the young settlement had yet experienced. Marcus carefully secured his door, checked that his modest woodpile sat protected under a small overhang, and settled inside his earth lodge to wait out whatever nature delivered. His neighbors scrambled to prepare in their conventional way, stacking enormous quantities of firewood within their cabins, hanging blankets over windows to reduce drafts, and gathering every available covering to bundle their families against the cold. The blizzard struck that evening with apocalyptic fury. Temperatures plummeted from 20 degrees to -15 within 2 hours, then continued falling throughout the night. Wind velocities exceeded 60 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions where visibility dropped to zero beyond an outstretched hand. The screaming wind found every weakness in wooden construction, blasting frigid air through gaps that had seemed insignificant during milder weather. By midnight, exterior temperatures had reached -38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill made conditions far worse, equivalent to -70 degrees for any exposed surface. This was life-threatening cold, the kind that could kill an unprotected person within minutes. Inside the Thompson cabin, William fed their stove frantically, burning log after log in desperate attempt to maintain tolerable warmth. Despite a roaring fire that made the stove's iron sides glow dull red, interior temperature struggled to reach 42 degrees. Frost formed on interior walls wherever warm air contacted cold surfaces, creating bizarre ice patterns that grew visibly larger as the night progressed. The children huddled together under every quilt and blanket the family owned, still shivering uncontrollably. Martha wrapped hot stones from the stove in cloth and placed them among the bedding, but they cooled within minutes. The family's water bucket froze solid despite sitting just 10 feet from the blazing stove. By 3 in the morning, William had burned through his entire indoor woodpile and faced a terrifying choice: venture outside into the killing storm to retrieve more firewood, or begin burning their furniture and possessions to keep the fire alive until dawn. He chose the latter, feeding their only spare chair into the stove and watching helplessly as his family's situation grew increasingly desperate. Similar scenes played out in every wooden cabin across the settlement. Families burned through impossible quantities of fuel, yet still suffered in barely above freezing conditions. The very young and very old faced genuine hypothermia risk. Several families seriously discussed abandoning their claims and fleeing to the railroad town if they survived until morning. Meanwhile, 6 feet underground, Marcus experienced an entirely different night. He'd lit his usual small evening fire around sunset, burning just 3 logs to bring interior temperature to a comfortable 65 degrees. As the storm raged overhead with its apocalyptic winds and catastrophic cold, Marcus sat peacefully at his small table, reading by lamplight, occasionally listening to the muffled howl of wind that sounded distant and unthreatening through 6 feet of earth. His fire had gone completely cold by 9 in the evening. No matter. The massive earthen walls surrounding him maintained their stable 55-degree baseline, utterly unaffected by surface conditions. The modest heat his small fire had contributed earlier remained trapped within the thermal mass, slowly radiating inward throughout the night. Marcus slept soundly under a single wool blanket, never once waking from cold discomfort. Around him, his earth lodge maintained a steady temperature that never dropped below 60 degrees, despite the raging frozen hell occurring mere feet above his grass-covered roof. He had no need to burn furniture, no need to wake repeatedly feeding fires, no need to huddle desperately hoping for survival until dawn. His dwelling simply ignored the storm, protected by the oldest and most reliable insulation available, the earth itself. Morning came slowly, the blizzard continuing unabated through dawn and into midday. When the storm finally broke around 2 in the afternoon, survivors emerged from their cabins exhausted, traumatized, and facing grim reality. Multiple families had completely exhausted their firewood supplies, several had burned precious furniture and tools, and everyone questioned whether they could possibly endure another night if the storm returned. William Thompson stood outside his cabin, surveying the damage, his face gray with exhaustion from being awake for 30 continuous hours tending their fire. His children had survived, but were suffering symptoms of mild hypothermia. His entire indoor firewood supply was gone, and the outdoor pile sat buried under 6-foot snowdrifts. Then he saw something that made him question his own sanity. Marcus emerged from his underground entrance looking completely rested and comfortable, without any visible signs of hardship. The old man stretched casually in the weak winter sunlight, seemingly unbothered by the catastrophic storm that had nearly killed everyone else in the settlement. Thompson stared in disbelief. "How?" he began, his voice cracking from exhaustion. "How did you survive? We nearly froze to death, and you look like you just woke from a pleasant nap." Marcus regarded the younger man calmly. "Come inside and see for yourself," he offered simply. Thompson followed Marcus down the short ramp into the underground dwelling, and the moment he crossed the threshold, understanding hit him like a physical blow. The interior felt genuinely warm, not the harsh, localized heat near a blazing stove, but an even, gentle warmth that permeated the entire space. Thompson instinctively reached out to touch the earthen wall and found it pleasantly warm beneath his palm, radiating stored heat like sun-warmed stone. Marcus's small stove sat completely cold, no fire burning, no coals glowing, yet the dwelling maintained comfortable temperature that Thompson estimated around 60 to 65 degrees, 23 degrees warmer than his own cabin had achieved while burning furniture through the night. "But your fire is out," Thompson stammered, struggling to comprehend what he was experiencing. "How is it so warm in here?" Marcus gestured to the thick earthen walls surrounding them. "The earth stays the same temperature all year round, about 55 degrees, 6 feet down. Doesn't matter if it's 100 above or 40 below on the surface. These thick walls hold that temperature like a battery holds electricity. I only need a small fire once a day to add a little extra warmth. The earth does the rest." Thompson looked around the underground space with new eyes, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't a primitive hole in the ground. This was sophisticated engineering that had been perfected over thousands of years by people who actually understood how to survive in extreme climates. "The Indians knew this," Marcus continued quietly. "The Pawnee, Mandan, they built earth lodges just like this and lived comfortable through winters that would kill any white man in a wooden cabin. Same in Iceland, Norway, my old mining camps in Colorado. Anywhere the cold gets serious, smart people build into the earth, not on top of it." Thompson felt shame wash over him, remembering his mockery, his certainty that the old man had lost his mind. "We've been fools," he said quietly. "All of us. Calling you crazy while you were the only one who actually understood how to survive here." The desperation in Thompson's eyes was evident as he asked the question that had brought him here. "My children barely made it through last night. If another storm like that comes, I don't know if we can survive in our cabin. Is there any way, could we possibly shelter with you if the weather turns bad again?" Marcus considered the request. His small underground space couldn't possibly accommodate Thompson's entire family, but the principle of the design could help them survive. "Better idea," he said. "Let me teach you how to modify your cabin. We can bank earth around the north wall where the wind hits hardest. That'll help. And I'll show you how to build a small earth-covered addition just big enough for your children to sleep warm. Won't take long, and it'll save their lives if another big storm comes." Word of Thompson's visit to Marcus's earth lodge spread rapidly through the settlement. Other families, humbled by their near-death experience during the blizzard, began seeking out the elderly homesteader they'd previously mocked. Over the following weeks, Marcus became the settlement's most sought-after advisor. He taught families how to bank earth against their cabin walls for additional insulation, how to build small earth-covered sleeping quarters attached to existing structures, and most importantly, he explained the fundamental principles of thermal mass and the Earth's constant temperature. Some families went further, beginning construction of complete earth lodges similar to Marcus's design. They discovered what he'd known all along. Building underground was actually easier and far cheaper than constructing wooden cabins. The materials were literally free, available everywhere across the prairie. The labor was straightforward, digging and stacking, and the results were undeniable structures that stayed comfortable year-round while using a fraction of the fuel required by conventional buildings. Anna Kowalski, the elderly Polish woman who'd recognized Marcus's wisdom from the start, worked with her adult sons to build an earth lodge even larger than Marcus's original. They incorporated improvements based on her childhood memories of European earth dwellings, including a small above-ground cupola that provided better ventilation and additional natural light. By the following autumn, the settlement's appearance had transformed dramatically. More than half the homesteads now featured earth-sheltered construction, some fully underground like Marcus's design, others partial dugouts with sod walls and earthen roofs. The landscape looked less like a collection of isolated wooden cabins and more like a prairie dog town, with small doors and windows emerging from grass-covered mounds scattered across the plains. When the next winter arrived, the difference in fuel consumption was staggering. Families in earth lodges burned roughly 1/4 the firewood compared to the previous year in wooden cabins. More importantly, everyone slept comfortably without fear of freezing, and children stayed healthy without the respiratory problems that had plagued the settlement's first winter. The economic impact extended beyond mere fuel savings. Families that previously spent their entire summer cutting, hauling, and stacking firewood could now invest that labor into actually farming and building their homesteads. Crops improved because farmers had time to properly tend them. Livestock survived better because barns could be built with earth-sheltered designs. And the overall prosperity of the settlement increased dramatically. Marcus never sought recognition or compensation for sharing his knowledge. He continued living quietly in his original earth lodge, satisfied to see families thriving, using principles he'd learned from miners, native peoples, and ancient European building traditions. Historical records from Nebraska Territory document the spread of earth-sheltered construction during this period. Settlers across the plains discovered that sod houses and dugouts weren't primitive temporary shelters, but sophisticated permanent dwellings ideally suited to their environment. Some of these structures remained continuously inhabited for 40 or 50 years, outlasting many wooden cabins that deteriorated from weather exposure and required constant maintenance. The physics principles Marcus had intuitively understood are now well documented by modern building science. Earth-sheltered architecture offers numerous measurable advantages in extreme climates. The ground's stable temperature eliminates the dramatic heat gain and loss that plague surface structures. Massive earthen walls provide exceptional thermal mass that moderates temperature swings. Reduced surface area exposure minimizes the building envelope through which heat can escape. Contemporary passive solar design and earth-sheltered construction continue using these exact same principles. Modern earthships, bermed homes, and underground housing developments apply Marcus's fundamental insights with updated materials and techniques. The wisdom hasn't changed, only the tools available for implementation. By the time Marcus passed away in 1896 at the age of 78, the settlement he'd helped transform had become a thriving community. His original earth lodge remained structurally sound, its thick earthen walls still performing exactly as designed decades after construction. The dwelling eventually became a kind of shrine, preserved by the community as a reminder of the old man's wisdom and the value of learning from diverse sources. The broader lesson Marcus's story teaches extends far beyond building techniques. Innovation often comes not from rejecting traditional knowledge, but from recognizing and adapting proven solutions developed by cultures with direct experience in relevant conditions. The Native American earth lodge, the Icelandic turf house, the mining camp dugout, all represented accumulated wisdom refined through countless generations of trial and error. Marcus's genius wasn't inventing something new. His genius was recognizing that ancient solutions could answer modern problems, that primitive didn't mean inferior, and that the earth itself offered resources more valuable than any material that could be purchased or imported. The settlement's initial mockery of his underground dwelling reflected a common human failing, the assumption that newer, more expensive, or more conventional approaches must be superior to older, simpler, or unfamiliar methods. Sometimes, the most effective answer has existed for thousands of years, waiting for someone humble enough to learn from it. When Marcus Brennan chose to dig his home 6 feet into the Nebraska prairie rather than building upward with expensive timber, he wasn't being eccentric or primitive. He was applying sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, practical knowledge of the Earth's properties, and humble willingness to learn from cultures his neighbors dismissed as inferior. The result was a dwelling that maintained 65 degrees of comfort while outside temperatures plunged to -40, used 75% less fuel than conventional construction, and proved its superiority when the ultimate test arrived in the form of that catastrophic blizzard. His underground shelter didn't just save his own life that brutal winter night. It opened his neighbors' eyes to possibilities they'd never considered, transformed an entire settlement's approach to survival on the harsh plains, and preserved knowledge that continues informing sustainable architecture more than a century later. Sometimes the wisest course isn't following the crowd or trusting conventional wisdom. Sometimes wisdom means going underground while everyone else builds upward, choosing thermal mass over aesthetic appearance, and valuing proven function over social acceptance. Marcus Brennan's Earth Lodge stood as physical proof that ancient wisdom could outperform modern methods, that working with nature beats fighting against it, and that the strongest shelter sometimes comes from embracing the earth rather than trying to rise above it.